The previous lecture, I talked about the goddess worship and how that can be reintroduced in some sort of new form today. So now I'm going to go back to ancient Greece, and I'm going to start with Crete and the Minoan civilization on Crete because it's the oldest known civilization in that area. Starhawk said that witchcraft began 35,000 years ago, um, and in Crete, the culture emerged sort of 2800 BC till 1100 BCE, and it mostly fell because of earthquakes. It was a, a more egalitarian society. It was focused around fertility rites. Um, it had a very high level of evolution. It had farming. It was agricultural rather than nomads. They had great architecture, engineering, pottery, stone carving. They worked with metal, gold, bronze. Their palaces were unfortified, which indicates that there was peaceful coexistence within the cities in Crete, and also that they had peaceful relations with other cities, foreigners. They promoted the arts through their trade. They had a very sophisticated trading system. They had a writing system, linear A, and they had a lot of art, wall painting. The wall painting depicted everyday life, religion, nature, but all with a focus on educating people in how to live. It wasn't frivolous or just some way to show someone you have money. It was very much functional. It was related to the religion and to the human species educating itself in how to live. I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book by Dr. Nano Mananatos called Art and Religion in Thera. Thera is now located in what's called Santorini, but the culture in Thera she compares to the culture in Crete, Minoan culture, and she did excavations there. And she saw some really interesting things, and it indicates that this is what's really important. There were many customs, rituals, the construction of society in Crete had an influence on subsequent development in Greece, but especially on the mainland. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Well, the first thing was there were wall paintings of antelope sort of fighting, going head to head, but in a playful way, as just a way for them to exercise, to maintain strength. Then there were also wall paintings of boys boxing. And so, again, you have this ritual of sports, not ferocious and competitive, but just for the sake of physical fitness and also fitness in case there was any outside attack. It's just that they just didn't have much indication that there had been. But that's a precursor to the Olympics, obviously. So the mainland, the Peloponnese didn't invent the idea of the Olympics. It partly simply comes from the human condition, but it also came from Crete. Crete had already done it. Their culture was centered around fertility rites, and Demeter, one of the most sacred religious shrines and rituals, took place on the mainland at the Eleusinian Fields. And so, again, this is partly just human nature, but it's partly Crete. Crete had these fertility cults, and what developed in the mainland could have been a remnant of a Minoan mistress of nature. Might have been that they took their inspiration from Crete. The king of Crete was Minos, the king of Knossos, and his reputation was as a great legislator. And the story was that after he died in Hades, he was one of the three judges of the souls in the underworld. So he was given this incredibly sacred spot in mythology. And so again, this the most of all would put Crete as the archetype for a society that is sophisticated. It has a polis, political association. It has the rule of law. It has that ideal legislator that Hesiod mentions in his creation story. The model that we all want to follow is the judge who arbitrates disputes uh, wisely. So Minos, the king of Crete, he was the king of Knossos, which was the central city, the main city in Crete. So he represents Cretan culture, also represents this ultimate ideal of the practically wise person. So, and then finally, the people who started the shrine at Delphi, which was the most sacred shrine, it was the international spot where people came to get wise advice. So this is the place on the mainland where the priests at Delphi represent Hesiod's icon of the ultimate achievement of the wise ruler. So Crete stood out in the minds of the Greeks as a reminder or as an archetype against which they could evaluate their own city-state, their own society and culture as better or worse. They had a model to follow, and a lot of this, of course, was just an idea or an archetype, but that's the way a historical example of Crete becomes mythologized by art. So you go from the particular, somebody who is an artist who understands the pattern starts telling a story that isn't just a historical story, it's also an artistic, mythological story that tries to educate people about how to live. Now, Dr. Nano Mananatos concludes her book. She has a wonderful book about all the wall paintings, all the art, and the culture in Thera, Minoan culture, and she says, economic, religious, and everyday activities must have been intermingled to such an extent that a distinction between the secular and the religious is irrelevant and artificial. And I want to point out that the deities, the Olympian deities, indicate that all aspects of human life can be sacred and should be sacred. And sacred simply doesn't mean a supernatural realm. What it means is living for the sake of something greater than yourself, living at that higher level where you don't worry about all the particularities. You're living out the good life. You're living out the struggle between good and evil in this very archetypal level as much as you can. You're learning the lessons of the past and trying to imitate those archetypes of wisdom. The order of society, she goes on to talk about Minoan society, was based on the order of nature. A harmonious relationship between the two was necessary and achieved by a series of festivals. In these, the renewal of nature was celebrated in connection with events of social significance, such as victory and creation of new roles. One example were the initiation rites, especially of young girls, because they represented fertility. And when they start menstruating, that means they start being able to give birth. So that was a major religious uh, celebration, and it was a major initiation rite for a young girl. In this way, the social order was integrated into the perennial order of nature. It was the eternal and the recurring impressed the ancients, not the ethereal and transitory. Historical events implying singularity were meaningless because they were aberrations from the path of normalcy. But if they were part of a pre existing mental and religious system, like victory of order over chaos, they could be integrated in it through festivals. It is no accident that historical events are absent from Theran and Minoan art, and that political history was insignificant. There are no portraits, no leaders who stand out. It is interesting to compare Minoan and Theran art with that of the Greeks. The latter invented history, and it's no accident that they were interested in the phenomenon of change, as we can see by studying the Ionian philosophers of the Archaic period. The singular event and the individual character interested the Greeks much more than it did the Minoans. And this perhaps is why they developed narrative art, literature, and last but not least, drama. The Greeks developed drama. True drama is out of place in a world where the eternal and recurring is what matters. And what I want to argue in my lectures is that compared to the world we live in, even the Olympian and the Hellenic Greeks were really interested in patterns and pattern recognition, but they weren't they were also interested in social evolution. They assumed, they presented this mythological image of every generation being more complex than the previous one. Every every child grows up and comes of age in a society where they have to deal with things their parents didn't have to deal with, and so they assumed social evolution, but they also looked for patterns in this process. That there's some reoccurring patterns in the process of the development from one generation to another that you're going to have to learn about and avoid the making the mistakes. And then there's some things that are new, and that's how you promote evolution. So on the one hand, the Cretans, in the minds of some Greeks, might have been just a less developed society because it was so focused on the cyclical and what doesn't change. On the other hand, they had a very sophisticated legislative system, and they have this king who turns out to be one of the three best judges who is given the power to judge in Hades. So I think the message is pay attention. Think of Crete. Think of what you can learn from the Cretans. Um, they were a peace-loving society. They did not create unnecessary aggression in order to prove how brave they were. The society did not honor conquest or aggression in war or conflict. Um, so I think that's how it panned out over time. Also, I mean, all the way through, there's this shadow of Crete um, that I think the stories are intended to remind the Greeks of, especially their treatment of women, their treatment of Demeter, their treatment of the goddesses that represent the old Cretan matriarchal mythology. And then finally, Plato's laws, coming right at the end of Plato's life. he has an Athenian stranger talking to a Spartan and a Cretan. And so this is just an indication that this archetype, Crete, was in the mind of the Greeks as a paradigm, a pattern for a way to live against which they had to compare themselves. The other book I'm going to quote from is by Charlene Spretnak, called The Lost Goddesses of Early Greece. And she talks about the mythology of the god of Crete. So the previous author talked really about the archaeological sites and the ritual and the way it connected to the union of culture and nature. Spretnak goes and talks about the seven goddesses that we associate with Hellenic Greece, but this is pre-Hellenic. This is how the images of the goddesses before the takeover by men in patriarchy. And it's really interesting, and it shows you, gives you a very different model for how women would be treated, how these specific seven goddesses would be treated in a matriarchal society, or a society that balances male and female energies much better than ours does. Okay, so she starts out, she quotes from Joseph Campbell, who says, "In the very earliest ages of human history, the magical force and wonder of the female was no less a marvel than the universe itself, and this gave to women a prodigious power, which it has been one of the chief concerns of the masculine part of the population to break, control, and employ to its own ends." For thousands of years before the classical myths took form and then were written down by Hesiod and Homer in the 7th century BC, a rich oral tradition of myth-making had existed. A goddess was held sacred and was associated with order, wisdom, protection, and the life-giving processes, seasonal change, fertility of womb and field, and that's what the previous book talked about. Then Spretnak goes on, "The invaders' new gods, the Olympians, differ in many ways from the earlier goddesses. The pre-Hellenic goddesses are enmeshed with people's daily experiencing of the energy forces in life," which is what the book I just read from said, that the art connects people's everyday lives, nature, and religion. The Olympian gods, however, are distant, removed, up there. Unlike the flowing protective love of a mother goddess, the character of the Olympian gods is judgmental. This would be negative judgments, not the wise judgments of the Cretan ruler, Minos. Olympian gods are much more warlike than their predecessors and are often involved in strife. And that's what actually happened eventually in Crete. The Mycenaeans took over, who are the ones in Homer, and a militaristic spirit developed. So this is as a matter of historical fact, and then you can see how those patterns are played out in the changes in the myths. So Spretnak tries to piece together, she gets data as much as possible about the pre-Hellenic goddesses, and then she pieces together her own sort of story about how they would relate to each other based on as much data as possible, and then weaving it together into a worldview. She said that Carl Jung, quote, encouraged his patients to seek their own means of spiritual exploration and integration. He also encouraged scholars and other people to do so. The pre-patriarchal goddess tradition is a rich source from which women and men may draw. Yahweh God the Father is not the omnipotent deity of all humankind, but is merely a figure in one of the many mythological religious systems from which people may select personally meaningful aspects. In a world where spiritual expressions are valued for nurturing integration, growth, and a sense of our embeddedness in nature, rather than for providing lockstep control over a populace, diversity and evolutionary process are honored. Such are the values of pre patriarchal and post patriarchal spirituality. So, once again, we get this theme that the Enlightenment, patriarchy, which went way before the Enlightenment, that recent developments in science have led us back to the uh, the ancient wisdom, mythology, and traditions. So she starts out with Gaia, which when we read Hesiod's Theogony, his creation story, he starts out there too. Gaia is the earth, free of birth or destruction, of time or space, of form or condition, is the void. From the eternal void, Gaia danced forth and rolled herself into a spinning ball. She molded mountains along her spine, valleys in the hollows of her flesh. A rhythm of hills and stretching plain followed her contours. Gaia watched her plants and animals grow. In time she brought forth from her womb 6 women and 6 men. And I'll compare that with what Hesiod says later on. Then we have Pandora, the image of Pandora in the Minoan documents. What we have is very, very different from that Pandora's box, where Pandora opened the box and let out all the evils in the world. So Hesiod tended to blame women for evil. I'm sorry, this is not the Minoan version. Okay. The Kore, or maiden, form of the earth goddess is Pandora. So all of the goddesses are basically emanations from the great goddess. They all emerged from her, just like everything else emerges. So that notion of emergence, which is contemporary, was built right into goddess mythology. Pandora is pictured on ancient vessels as a figure rising from the earth with outstretched arms. Classicists familiar with the original role of Pandora have called Hesiod's famous story, which features the goddess as a curious, troublesome gift. The classicists call that a perverted virgin. No longer does Pandora bring the abundance of the earth goddess's gifts in her great jar, or pithos, but only disease, misery, and death. Woman, who was the inspirer, becomes the temptress. She who made all things, gods and mortals alike, is become their plaything, their slave, endowed only with physical beauty and with a slave's tricks and blandishments. So this is really a profound difference. The images on these Minoan jars have Pandora. She has a jar, but it's full of all these gifts that help human beings flourish. So Charlene Spretnak has created this myth of Pandora. First of all, she says the Earth Mother gave mortals life, but they started to get hungry, and they started having a lot of needs. So Demeter sent Pandora from the underworld. Pandora says, quote, "I am Pandora, giver of all gifts." She lifted the lid from the large jar. She took a pomegranate, which became an apple. "I bring you flint to make fire. I bring you wonder, curiosity, memory. I bring you wisdom. I bring you justice with mercy. I bring you caring and communal bonds. I bring you courage, strength, endurance. I bring you loving kindness for all beings. I bring you the seeds of peace. So obviously, this is everything she mentions are activities of soul that went on in Crete. So that's probably the reason why she mentions them, is that all the actual things the Minoans were doing, they thought of as gifts from Pandora that she pulled out of her big jar after Demeter sent her there to help them. Um, Demeter created them, the fertility goddess, and then she sent her daughter to give them the tools she needs so that they could flourish. Very different than Hesiod's version. Okay, the next is Themis, and Themis uh, was also co-opted by the Olympians later on. But first, I'll do Spretnak's version. Themis is the force that binds people together. She's the collective conscience, the social imperative, the social order. At first, she is of the tribe. Later in the polis, she takes the shape of law. She becomes the personification of justice and righteousness. She convenes and dissolves the meetings on Mount Olympus. She also presides over feasts. Now this is important because follows what Aristotle said and what Hesiod and the myths describe as social evolution. First, people live together in biological groups or tribes. Then they come together to be more efficient in meeting their basic physical needs. And finally, says Aristotle, they make that leap to understanding their condition as the creature able to understand in a world that can be understood, and they want to bind together under a common body of laws. They want to create this order which imitates the order of the universe and integrates with it. So Themis represents that binding principle, and Themis moves to these different levels of complexity. So Spretnak makes up this myth. When the first man entered a cave and witnessed the first woman's magic of drawing forth a new person from her body, Themis was there. The young shall be fed and nourished, protected and loved. Neighboring clans sought better water sources, needed new shelters, settled common ground. Themis united them to peace. Themis watched and issued from her oracles pronouncements of order, justice, and mercy. Barbarian invaders swept down through her mainland and later her islands. They seized Themis at the outset. With the goddess a bound captive, the invaders proclaimed a new order. Children must be named after their fathers. Cities must be fortified. Power must be worshipped. They established their new god, Zeus, who ruled by the terror of his thunderbolt and procreated by deception and rape. Yet Themis would not be silenced. You dare not crush the primal order. When your new gods and your mutilations of our old goddesses assemble on Mount Olympus, I alone will have the right to convene them. I will not die. So, again, that iconography says that the Olympian gods, who are the image of male domination, have to be convened by this goddess from Crete, because the decisions they make have to be within the context of this larger natural cyclical order, this principle of nature as an equilibrium. And the Olympian gods can't overstep their bounds. And if they do, the powers of nature that drive toward equilibrium will get them. Okay, the next one is Aphrodite. Aphrodite is a fertility goddess, the primal mother of all ongoing creation. She's a virgin in the original sense, which is basically independent, not necessarily abstaining from sex, but always remaining independent. She doesn't depend on men. And she has eternal beauty. Her sea birth is yet another version, along with that of Pandora and Persephone, of the arising of the goddess. So it's the emergence. So Aphrodite emerged from the sea. That was part of her emergence from the goddess and Gaia, the earth. So here's the way. Well, everybody knows in the patriarchal tradition, the story of the birth of Aphrodite was revised enormously. This powerful procreative goddess from Asia is portrayed as having been produced by the sea foam caused by the severed genitals of Uranus, who had been castrated by his son Kronos. So again, Hesiod really reinvents Aphrodite. So Spretnak creates this myth. Life was young and frail when Aphrodite arose with the breath of renewal. She wandered over the hills and plains, seeking out all living creatures. Magically she touched them with desire and sent them off in joyous pairs. She blessed the females' wombs. Each spring she returned with her doves to Cyprus for her sacred bath. Aphrodite walked into the sea, into the pulsing moon rhythms of the tide. When she emerged with her spirit renewed, spring blossomed fully, and all beings felt her joy. She alone understood the love that begets life. So she represents that eros. I talked about when I talked about witchcraft, has desire. Desire is that attraction and repulsion. It's the energy that pulses through the universe. And so Aphrodite represented that. It's that energy that causes animals, creatures to be attracted to each other, to have sex, to reproduce. And it's a very positive, obviously. Fertility, that's how fertility occurs, through this energy that includes Aphrodite, being blessed by Aphrodite. And Hesiod changes all of that. Then Spretnak talks about the triad of the moon. So in goddess worship, but especially in Crete, including Crete, there were three goddesses: Artemis, Selene, and Hecate, represented the phases of the moon. Artemis is the goddess of untamed nature. Among the rustic people, she's the most popular goddess in Greece. Central to her worship are ecstatic dances and the sacred bow, most probably derived from worship of the ancient moon tree, source of immortality, secret knowledge, and inspiration. Artemis assists females of all species in childbirth. In Olympian mythology, Artemis is made the sister of Apollo and the daughter of Zeus. Her mother is variously represented as Demeter or Persephone, or, most commonly, Leto. She also, unfortunately, is portrayed as a man-hater. Selene is the moon goddess who pulls the full moon across the sky with her chariot, and she got replaced with Apollo in that task. Hecate is the goddess of the waning and dark moon. Okay, so Spretnak invents this myth. The goddess lived with her nymphs amid the thick wild growth where animals joined freely in her games and dances. This is Artemis. She loved new birth. Whether at play or at rest, Artemis was ever alert for the rising moans of a mother giving birth. Artemis always appeared to a mother who called, and always rejoiced with her at the moment of birth. Artemis would smile at the new one and whisper to the mother, You may both enter my forest without fear, and join me on any night lit by the waxing moon. On the evening before the full moon, her sacred grove was filled with celebrants. On the evening before the full Artemis, the nurturer protector, goddess of the swelling moon, she began to merge with the sacred tree while the circle of dancers spun around her. So they had this incredible dance around a tree, and they all go into this sort of ecstasy and fall on the ground, kind of dizzy. They stared up at the constant dancers in the heavens. Through the stars, Selene was cutting a path with her chariot. Selene pulled the full moon across the sky. Okay, so they're dancing in the nighttime. They're looking up at the moon represented, which is Selene. When the moon slipped away, shrinking gradually into its own death, there were no festivities. Hordes of ghosts led by Hecate and her baying hounds roamed the earth on moonless nights. Yet she protected these mortals who purified themselves in her name. Hecate's disturbances were fierce, yet not all of the mortals feared them. Some longed to join her. Always Hecate taught the same lesson: without death there is no life. So there's this union of these three goddesses. The other thing about it is that Aphrodite and Artemis are two halves of the same whole. Aphrodite is the one that inspires animals and humans to mate, who gets them attracted to each other. Artemis then takes over toward the end of pregnancy and helps them when they deliver. So one focuses on getting creatures pregnant, and the other focuses on getting those babies born and healthy and the next generation started. So this is very different from the Olympian, where they are just sworn enemies. Okay, Hera is the next one. Hera is essentially the goddess of women and fecundity. Her connection with the three seasons of antiquity corresponds to the three stages of women's life: maiden, fertile woman, and elder. At Olympia, the goddess Hera long predates the temple of Zeus. The races were run among women from time immemorial. The runners were selected from three age groups, representing the three phases of the moon. The well-founded view among classicists is that the girls' races, which were held every 4 years at the feast of the worship of Hera, were far more ancient than the boys' races, which were first introduced only in the 7th century BC. So, of course, that's interesting, since we assume that the Olympics is all about men. Classicists, not all of them, but a lot of them have agreed that the temple to Hera built there was much older than the archaeological remains in the worship of Zeus and the traditional Olympics that we talk about. Hera was indigenous and represents a matrilineal system. She reigned alone at Argos, at Samos. Her temple at Olympia is distinct from and far earlier than that of Zeus. Her first husband, or rather consort, was Heracles. The conquering northerners passed from Dodona to Thessaly. Zeus drops his real shadow wife, Dione, at Dodona in passing from Thessaly to Olympia, and at Olympia, after the fashion of a conquering chieftain, marries Hera, a daughter of the land. In Olympus, Hera seems merely the jealous and quarrelsome wife. In reality, she reflects the turbulent native princess, coerced but never really subdued by an alien conqueror. And this story of a man coming and stealing or marrying the woman who's the indigenous, the daughter of the king, or is lived out over and over again in myth and in history and in the mythologizing of history. Okay, the myth of Hera. On the morning of the new moon, the women of Argos left their homes and walked together to the stream of the freeing water. Gradually Hera drew forth the blood of purification and renewed fertility. Those who received her gift were honored. Hidden in the foothills nearby, the spring called Kanathos flowed secretly, silently from Earth's womb. Each year Hera appeared to the Argive women at the spring. She bathed in the cool water and emerged with her virginity renewed once again. One in herself, the celestial virgin, Hera presided over the merging of the lunar cow and the solar bull. Then she looked out over the assembly and blessed the Argives with unfailing fecundity of field and womb. Every 4 years the benevolence of the goddess was celebrated at the feast of the Heraia. At Olympia she watched the foot races run in her name. Next is Athena. Athena is the patron of wisdom, arts, and skills, and she especially protects architects, sculptors, potters, spinners, and weavers. In Mycenae, when the Mycenaeans took over, she became the shielded defender of their citadels, particularly Athens. In other words, this militaristic spirit arose. In Olympian mythology, Athena is firmly established as the cold, rigid goddess of war. So suppressed and forgotten are her matrifocal Cretan origins that she's represented as a daughter born without a mother, having sprung fully armed from the head of Zeus. yeah, so we'll have to check out and see, is that a firm patriarchy, or is that a man describing patriarchy and showing how ugly it is, that the men are actually abusing women in the way that led to the birth of Athena. It was because Zeus was interested in power more than justice or truth that ended up happening. But I'll examine that when we get to it. Here is Spretnak, the myth of Athena. In the Minoan days of Crete, an unprecedented flower of learning and the arts was cultivated. Dynamic architecture, and this is clear. They had incredible engineering, incredible architecture. They were very sophisticated. They had a plumbing system where they used rainwater and had these little pipes. It's very sophisticated. Dynamic architecture rose to 4 stories, pillared and finely detailed, yet always infused with the serenity of the goddess. Patiently her mortals charted the heavens, devised a calendar, kept written archives. This is again where the book about witchcraft shows that way back these priestesses were working on math, astronomy, astrology. In the palaces they painted striking frescoes of her priestesses and sculpted her owl and ever-renewing serpent in the shrine rooms. Goddess figures and their rituals were deftly engraved on seals and amulets. Graceful scenes were cast in relief for gold vessels and jewelry. Athena nurtured all the arts, but her favorites were weaving and pottery. As the mortals moved forward, Athena guided the impulse of the arts. She knew they would never flourish in an era of strife, so she protected households from divisive forces and guarded towns against aggression. So invincible was the aura of her protection that the Minoans lived in unfortified coastal towns. Their shipping trade prospered, and they enjoyed a peace that spanned 1,000 years. To Athena, each family held the olive bough sacred. Each worshipped her in their home. Then quite suddenly the flowering of the Minoans was slashed. Northern barbarians, more fierce than the Aegean goddess had ever known, invaded the island and carried Athena away to Attica. There they made her a soldier. Okay, the next one is Demeter and Persephone. Demeter is the grain mother, the giver of crops. Persephone is the grain maiden, who embodies the new crop. The agricultural fertility ritual were rites practices by women only and were of extremely early origin. They were preserved in pristine purity down to the late days and were left almost uncontaminated by Olympian usage. They emerged later in the most widely influential of Greek rituals, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Prior to the Olympian version of the myth at a rather later date, there was no mention of rape in the ancient cult of Demeter and her daughter, nor was there any rape in the two traditions antecedent to Demeter's mythology. That the maiden form of the goddess would share the functions of the mature form, Demeter, as giver of crops on the earth and ruler of the underworld, was a natural extension. The early Greeks often conceived of their goddesses in maiden and mature forms simultaneously. Later, the maiden was called daughter. Whatever the impulse behind portraying Persephone as a rape victim, evidence indicates that this twist to the story was added after the societal shift from matrifocal to patriarchal, and that it was not part of the original mythology. In fact, it is likely that the story of the rape of the goddess is a historical reference to the invasion of the northern Zeus worshippers, just as the story of the stormy marriage of Hera, the native queen, who will not yield to the conqueror Zeus. So here's Spretnak's myth of Demeter and Persephone. There was once no winter. The goddess Demeter watched fondly as the mortals learned more and more about her plants. Seeing that their lives were difficult and their food supplies sporadic, she was moved to give them the gift of wheat. Demeter had a firstborn daughter, Persephone, who watched over the crops with her mother. Persephone said to her mother, "Mother, sometimes in my wanderings I've met the spirits of the dead hovering around their earthly homes, and sometimes the mortals too can see them. I spoke to them, Mother. They seem confused, and many do not even understand their own state. Is there no one in the nether world who receives the newly dead?" Demeter sighed and answered softly, "It is I who have domain over the underworld. From beneath the surface of the earth I draw forth the crops and the wild plants." And then Persephone says, "The dead need us, Mother. I will go to them." Demeter told her daughter of the dark gloom of the underworld and begged her to reconsider. Yet Persephone's response was unchanged. So her mother said, "Very well, you are loving and giving, and we cannot give only to ourselves. I understand why you must go. Still, you are my daughter, and for every day that you remain in the underworld, I will mourn your absence." Persephone gathered 3 poppies and 3 sheaves of wheat. Then Demeter led her to a long, deep chasm and produced a torch for her to carry. Thousands of spirits of the dead milled about aimlessly, hugging themselves, shaking their heads, and moaning in despair. As each spirit crossed before her, Persephone embraced the form and then stepped back and gazed into the eyes. "You have waxed into the fullness of life and waned into darkness. May you be renewed in tranquility and wisdom." For months Persephone received and renewed the dead, without ever resting or even growing weary. All the while her mother remained disconsolate. When Persephone ascended from a dark chasm, there was Demeter with a cape of white crocuses for her daughter. The mortals saw everywhere the miracles of Demeter's bliss and rejoiced in the new life of spring. Each winter they joined Demeter in waiting through the bleak season of her daughter's absence. Each spring they are renewed by the signs of Persephone's return. So this is an incredibly different image than the one we get in the Hellenic myths. So the picture here is that death is natural. There's nothing bad about it. It's part of the whole fertility. You can't have birth without death. But the spirits get confused. So Persephone just wanted them to become harmonized, become integrated, become part of the cycle of life, and realize that that's fine. So they're not so confused. And so for half of the year, she nurtures those in the underworld, and Demeter stops creating new life. Then she comes back, and Demeter fertility happens again. So you have the cycle of birth and death, and you have this also integration, as everything coming together, becoming part of the whole, and nothing is dissociated from the rest. So my conclusions are Spretnak's reimagination of the mythological images of the kind of culture it produced in Crete gives you this entirely different view. So you can shake your imagination, and you can, maybe it'll speak deeper into the unconscious, but it also make you a lot more critical and aware of the layers and layers of patriarchy that we have just taken on and assumed, and it's not natural, it's not healthy, and it's gotten us disconnected from the collective unconscious. And the points I want to make in terms of the development of culture in Greece is, first, Hesiod was flagrantly misogynistic. It's clear. He says it in Works and Days. He thinks women are horrible. His creation story is the story of the triumph of patriarchy over matriarchy. But, second part, Hesiod was also very critical of men and their continual struggles for power, abuses of power, and abuses of women. So I don't think when he talks about how they abuse women that he thinks that's natural or necessary. There's a lot of indications that he thinks, okay, men should rule, but they better not do this, don't do that, don't do that. They can get it wrong a lot of different ways. Hesiod seems to think the triumph of patriarchy was one part of social evolution, right? It's going to be better with men ruling. But he points out the many, many mistakes men make that cripple the process of social evolution and human flourishing. Next, the story of Crete is embedded in the minds of the Hellenic Greeks, and you can tell this because of the myth of Themos convening the assemblies of the gods. The Greeks did have a woman convening the assembly. Second, the oracle at Delphi and all of its iconography, which I'll go into, and the fertility rites at the Eleusinian fields. And these three are very sacred, and they keep reminding the Olympians, they send a clear message that the fertility of Mother Earth must be respected in the construction of more and more complex societies, and the use of human reason, this is from Delphi, to create laws, institutions, and advances in science and technology and medicine. This is what reason can do, and more complex levels of social life has to be controlled by the love of justice and truth. There are natural limitations to there are natural limiting conditions ordained by the Olympian gods, and reminded, and the culture of Crete reminds us of that. So, and then finally, the entire poetic tradition from then on, I think, I'm going to argue, assumed that the role of the poet is continually reminding men not to abuse women and not to get into power struggles with each other. The technique they used for education, this is another thing that people miss and scholars miss too, is cathartic. That starting with Hesiod, the poets magnified the excessive passions, the mistakes, the extremes. They show and describe the great harm they do, so that the listener will flush those desires out of their souls and be inspired to behave moderately and wisely. So, on the one hand, Hesiod doesn't think women are as evolved or capable of evolving as men. So he presents the evolution of the emergence of culture from nature, and it's dominated by men. But boy, he's critical of men. His stories are intended to show how ugly men can be. I don't think they're intended to justify it. They're using the educational tool of catharsis. You magnify. Here's the dark side of the unconscious, and the way that you educate it, so that all those energies deep inside, those are animal. They started out as animal energies. How do you transform them from aggressive, just the drive for pleasure and power, to the creative construction of a complex society that has people relating at these very high levels? And Hesiod does it indirectly by telling people, don't do this, don't do that. And again, he starts out, which a lot of the documents do, with the model of the just ruler, right? The just ruler sits on his throne, people come to him with their problems, and he understands their problems, right? In his mind, he listens to all these stories about all the excesses people can do. So he's tapped into his own unconscious. He understands people are capable of behaving in these ways that the people who come to him have behaved. And he makes a judgment because he understands them, and he can figure out uh, how challenged were they, how much pressure were they under, how much had they suffered, and before they reacted in this extreme way. So he could make much better judgments because the muses were speaking to him. So a good ruler really likes to hear all those stories about human vices and evils, because then he can make better judgments, even though he doesn't himself act that way. So I think that's what Hesiod was up to, that's what Homer was up to. Um, if you want to be wise, you have to really understand evil and wickedness and transform it. Figure out how to not only transform the energy in yourself, but also inspire, um, make good judgments about punishment, but also inspire people through the example you set and through the listening to the stories of the poets. Listen to them together, and so you know that given all of human frailty and vulnerability and ignorance, that you actually are progressing. You're avoiding the worst mistakes. You're moving your society forward. You're part of social evolution rather than social decay and destruction.